Okay, now we learned how you can create a database, how you can create a table, insert values into the table and all. Now let's talk about data integrity. Data integrity means like you're forcing the records to follow a set of rules. Like we already have one, like the data type of the column. So we told that inventory ID should always be an integer, name should be a varchar, price should be an integer, and quantity should be an integer. So let me create a new item into the table, and let's say with a 10 as the inventory ID and maybe a mic, $100 and 50 items. So this looks valid and it will be inserted, we know that. Because inventory ID is 10 and 10 is integer, we know that. Name is a mic and mic is varchar. Price is 100 and 100 is an integer. Quantity is 50 and quantity is an integer. So we know that it's going to work. Now what if I change quantity to string like this? This is a quantity. Will this work? Well, let's check it out. We get an error. That is incorrect integer value. This is a quantity for column quantity. So you can see that we were trying to insert a record with quantity as this one. This is a quantity. And we know that quantity should be an integer. But is this an integer? No, it's not an integer. So it will not be inserted into the table. In fact, if we go and refresh our table, you should not see mic anywhere here. So if we just change the quantity to a real integer like 50 and run it, we should not see any error. And if we go back and refresh, you should see the mic to be inserted. So when we provided a record with data type that does not match to a particular column, like in our case we made quantity as a string and we told that quantity is an integer. So SQL makes sure that all the records that are inserted into the table follow the data type of that particular column. So this also ensures data integrity. That is, all the records that are inserted follow a set of rules. Now not only the data type, you have more rules you can insert to maintain data integrity. Now if you look at our table, you can see we have a null item over here, that is no value. So even though price was integer, but null can be inserted. So because none doesn't have any value, so it's valid to enter. But what if you do not want a null value to be inserted into a particular column? Let's say you always want price to have a value. Like in other items, for example, we had value for the price like 400, 1000, 1200 and all. But one of them is null because when we were inserting into the table, we skipped the price item. Now let's skip the quantity item. So I'll name it camera and 12 for example. There are 12 cameras. There are 12 cameras and the price is 100. Now let me skip the quantity. So I can just remove the quantity because I do not want to enter quantity into the table. So obviously I should not put quantity over here also. So inventory ID is 12, name is camera, price is 200. And what is quantity? Well, we are not inserting quantity. So if you run it, if we refresh it, you can see a camera was inserted with quantity of null. So that's maybe okay for price and quantity. But what about name? In our case, we always want a name to have a value. Now obviously you cannot have an item with no name. Maybe you didn't decide the price, or maybe you do not know how many items are there in the inventory. So maybe price and quantity you could put null. But for name you should always have a value. Now imagine an item with no name, like null name. So it doesn't make sense. So we should always force the name column to have a value, should not be null anytime. So we have a constraint for that, a command that instructs SQL that a particular column should not be null. So for name, after you type the data type, just add a space and then put not null. So what will this do is it will not allow a record to not have a name. That is, it should not be null. Whenever you skip the name, for example, you skip like this, SQL doesn't allow this particular record to be inserted into the column because it doesn't have a name. So now let's run it and let's see if this item is being inserted. Now actually you can see that this value was inserted into the table. So if you go and refresh, you can see a new item was created with name null. That means no name at all, so no value. But how is it possible? We're told that name should not be null, it should always have a value. Well, that's because we're told that create this table if not exists. So if inventory table does not exist, then only create this table. Now we already have an inventory table existing, so this whole thing didn't run only. So this also was not run, so SQL doesn't know that it's a not null column. So what can we do for now? Because this table won't be created only because we already have a table called inventory. So what we could do is we'll just delete this table for now. So now we do not have any table called inventory. So this whole thing will be run again, and hopefully this not null will be there in the name column. Okay, so we deleted the table just because an inventory table already existed and this whole thing didn't run. And our previous inventory table did not have this not null characteristic. So now we do not have that inventory table. So when we run this file, a new table will be created and this not null will be there for the name column. Let's run this file and refresh. Yeah, so our new inventory table was created. And if you have a look at our table, you can see we do not have any values because the previously entered values were deleted. We deleted this table so that we could run this whole thing again. So first let's try to enter valid data and check if it's working. So inventory ID, name, price and quantity. So 1, and the second thing is name, so I'll name it milk, price 4 and quantity 30. So if I run this and refresh our inventory table, a new item was inserted. And now for example, if you skip the quantity column and run this file again, a new item should be inserted now without a quantity because we didn't specify the quantity while inserting it. So it works for now. But what about the name column? We're told that name should not be null. So let's try to insert a value without the name column. So let me delete the name and also over here. So now we are creating an item with inventory ID and price. So only inventory ID and price. We are not specifying the name. Let's see what happens now. If I run it, you can see we get an error. Field name doesn't have a default value. So what does that mean is, you can see that we are not inserting the name value into the name column while inserting this new record. It does not have a name. And we said that name should not be null. So it will not be inserted. You can see if I refresh, that new item was not inserted without the name. Earlier it was possible, but now it is not because we told SQL that name should not be null. Now quantity can be null because we didn't specify it, but name should not be null. So this is an invalid entry. So let's insert the name, maybe a laptop with item 3, and the first item is inventory ID, second item is price, and the third item is the item name, so name, like that. And if I run it, there should not be any error. And if you refresh, you can see our new item was inserted without a quantity because we didn't say SQL that quantity should not be null. Only the name cannot be null in our case. Now apart from not null, there are several other constraints we're going to learn in this video. By the way, this thing is a constraint. We can have multiple constraints. So another constraint we're going to discuss is the default constraint. So if you do not enter anything, let's say we're not entering anything into the quantity table, it's null. But what if you need a default value? So let's suppose you did not put quantity while inserting a new record. So it should have a default value. So I'll go over here and add a new constraint called default. Default 0. So what it means, like if you do not put a quantity while inserting a new record, then what happens is its default value will be 0. It will not be null, it will be 0. So if you run this file, actually it's not going to happen because this whole line is not going to be run because we already have an inventory table in the database. So this whole thing will not be run, and therefore this default 0 will also not be run. So I'll just delete this table again. Now don't worry, in upcoming videos we'll learn how you can modify the table and all that. But for now, I'll just delete and recreate it again. So delete, and our inventory table should be empty. Actually, the inventory table is not even there because we deleted it. So let's run it and refresh. You should see our newly created table. So now if you take a look at our table and refresh it, you should already have a laptop because we inserted a new laptop. Now, while inserting this new record, we didn't specify the quantity. So quantity was not specified at all while creating a new record. But if you see over here, you can see quantity is 0. Quantity is not null, it's 0, because we specified that if a quantity was not inserted, its default value should be 0. If we didn't specify this, then without a quantity while inserting a record, this thing would be null. But now we specify that default should be 0. So if you do not specify a quantity, it will be the default value. So you can also have a string like this, for example, in case you want string as a default quantity. But over here it won't work because we told that string is an integer. So for this case, this thing won't work. But let's say for name you want a default name. So then you can insert it like this, default and then your default string. So in our case, quantity is an integer. So I'll just put 0 over here. So 0 quantity is default. So that's why we specified only inventory ID, price, and the name. We didn't specify quantity. So the default was taken, that is 0. Now if you specify the quantity, let's say we have like 45 mobile and the price is 400. So this new item, and also we have to specify the quantity over here because we are entering a quantity. So inventory ID is 4, price is 400, name is mobile, and quantity is 45. Last time when we didn't specify quantity, the default was 0 because we specified over here. So now we are inserting a quantity that is 45. So if you run this file, our new item should have a quantity. Okay, so there was an error. So the error is, okay, sometimes that happens. I'll just run this whole thing again and you can see the error is gone. I don't know why, but sometimes it happens like that. So I'll just go to our inventory table and refresh it. You can see a new mobile with quantity of 45 because we provided the quantity value for this particular record. So 45 was inserted. Last time we didn't provide, so a default was inserted, that is 0 in our case. And if this whole thing was not there, that is the default constraint, then quantity would be null. Let's talk about a unique constraint. So currently we can put duplicate values, such as we already have an inventory ID 4, that is mobile phone. So if I enter a new item that is with the inventory ID 4, and let's say I'll just name it laptop, for example, no, TV. So now TV inventory ID is 4. So if I insert it and refresh the table, you can see we got a new item, TV. And the inventory ID of the TV is 4. Now we already have an inventory ID 4 earlier. So now we're creating a new item with the same inventory ID. But sometimes you do not want that thing to happen. Now in our case, inventory ID should always be unique. Our inventory ID should not be repeated again and again. So this is a really good example to use a new constraint called unique. So unique makes sure that any new record inserted should not have a duplicate value. So we want inventory ID should always be unique. So now what SQL does is whenever a new record is inserted, inventory ID should always be unique. So in our case, this whole thing should not be inserted into the table because we already have an inventory ID with 4. So let's try to do that. First of all, we'll delete this inventory table because as I already told, this whole thing won't be run because we already have an inventory table. So I'll just delete it and run this whole thing again. So I'll just name it 1 for now and run it. You can see we have the first item, that is with inventory ID 1, name TV, price 400 and quantity 45. Now I will insert the same thing again. Repeated because we didn't specify them to be unique. Now inventory ID cannot be the same again. So in our case, we already have an inventory ID with number 1. So if I try to insert this again, you should see an error. Duplicate entry 1 for key inventory.inventory ID. So in the inventory table and in the inventory ID column, inventory.inventory ID, you can see that it shows an error, duplicate entry 1. We were trying to insert a new item with inventory ID 1, but we already have one with the inventory ID as 1, so that's not possible. So if I change it to 2 and run this whole thing again, you should not see an error, and if I refresh the table, you should see a new item with inventory ID 2, and name, price and quantity are the same because we didn't say SQL that these all should be unique. So duplicate values are allowed over here. But you can see in case of inventory ID, duplicate values were not allowed. So we have to insert a new value or a new record into the table with unique inventory ID. Let's talk about auto increment constraint. Now earlier, whenever we used to insert a new record, we always used to specify the inventory ID. First, when we inserted with the value of 1, it was inserted, and then we had to specify value of 2, and then we have to insert. So now if we want to insert a new item, let's say a mobile phone, then we have to check first was the last item, that is 2. So now we have to put 3 over here. So that's okay to some extent, but not efficient. You have to always specify the inventory ID. So let me run it and refresh the table. You can see we got 1, 2 and 3. So we were inserting inventory ID manually. So now there is another constraint called auto increment. What it will do is it will check the last item and increase by 1. So if we add auto increment constraint to the inventory ID, what it will do is it will check what's the last item, that is 3. So now the next item we insert will be 4. So let's try that. We'll add an auto increment. Auto increment constraint. And by the way, a column can have multiple, like we have a unique, we have auto increment and so on. You can add multiple constraints, no problem. So first of all, we'll start by deleting our table and run this whole file again. So I'll not specify inventory ID. Okay, so I'll just remove it. So by default, it should start by 1. So what will happen is a new item will be created with inventory ID of 1, price of 400, name, mobile and quantity of 45. So if we run it and refresh our table, you can see 1 was inserted. And just leave this thing, that's because of auto increment. You can just ignore this, but just check the first item. That is, inventory is 1, name is mobile, price is 400, quantity is 45. These all were provided by us, but this one was provided by that auto increment feature. So first one is number 1. Now let's insert another item, let's say TV and price of $300 maybe, and run it. So if I refresh the table, you can see it's number 2. So it's being auto incremented again and again. Let's insert multiple values. So with a 400 of, let's insert multiple values. So price as 1,200, name as laptop maybe, and quantity 30 laptops for example. So in each of these values, we didn't specify the name of the column, that is inventory ID. So we only specified price, name and quantity. We didn't specify inventory ID. But because of the auto increment feature or auto increment constraint, it should automatically increment by 1. So we have 2. So this should be 3, that is TV should be 3 and laptop should be 4. If you run it and refresh the table, yes, it works. 3 TV and 4 is laptop. So that was auto increment constraint.